The algebra of cost volume profit analysis. There are some formulas involved in calculating break-even levels. These can be hard to memorize. However, they are derived from simple mathematical identity that you already know. Operating profit is revenues minus cost. Operating profit is revenues minus cost. Cost volume profit analysis is used with volume-based costing. It provides us with tools for making statements about costs and operating profits at different levels of an organization's activities. When we choose to make use of volume-based costing, we're choosing to construct and use a model of an organization's resource inputs and its outputs. We choose to represent the relationship between the inputs and the outputs as costs of two types, variable and fixed. Now we know that this representation of all costs as either variable or fixed is not fully accurate. However, we want to model a simplified representation. We want a useful model. The details are going to be stripped down so that we have a simplified but useful representation. It's not fully accurate, but it is workable. Some costs are fixed with respect to certain activities and not fixed with respect to other activities. Consider that we can measure volume of activity from the input side of an organization or from the output side. We can measure volume either on input or output. So it should be no surprise that when we consider a particular activity, that choice of activity may determine whether a resource cost is variable or fixed. Now, without getting deeper into volume-based costing, let's take a look at the algebra of cost volume profit for determining break-even and other target profit levels. Operating profit, as you know, is revenues, and since we've defined all costs as either variable or fixed, we can say revenues minus variable cost minus fixed cost, which we can represent using Q for quantity, VCU for variable cost per unit, and FC for fixed cost. So Q times P minus the product of Q times VCU minus fixed cost. That's operating profit. If you're looking for the break-even level, either in Q or in sales, we'll typically be asked to provide it in either Q or in sales, quantity or sales, then we're going to take that operating profit formula and we're going to set operating profit equal to 0. So that's going to take the operating profit equals Q times P minus Q times VCU minus fixed cost. That becomes 0. And then if we do that, we can then combine the Q terms. So 0 equals Q times parentheses price minus variable cost per unit, close the parentheses, minus fixed cost. That price minus the variable cost per unit is the thing that we call contribution margin per unit. If we continue with the algebra, then you see the formula rewritten there. 0 equals Q times P minus VCU times the contribution margin per unit minus the fixed cost. If you want to know the break-even quantity, then one way to do it is to isolate Q on one side of the equation. Now first I'm going to move FC, fixed cost, over to the left-hand side to clear out the 0. And so I'm going to add fixed cost to the left side and to the right side. Then I'll end up with fixed cost equals, and on the right-hand side, fixed cost minus and fixed cost plus cancel out, and so I end up with fixed cost equals quantity times price minus variable cost per unit, or said differently, fixed cost equals quantity times the contribution margin per unit. Now I can take and divide both sides by the contribution margin per unit, and I end up with the formula that you're familiar with, quantity equals fixed cost divided by the contribution margin per unit. That allows me to say this is my break-even quantity. Now if I'm interested in break-even in sales, then I can just take quantity times price. That is, multiply the units required to break even by the unit price. And that's pretty easy to do. For me, this is the simplest way to to determine the formula for break-even quantity. Calculate that, and then move from there to break-even sales. You could go back to that original formula, set operating profit to 0, solve by isolating price, and then again multiplying price by quantity to get to the dollar amount of sales. That can be done. You end up with a little more algebra involved, but it's not undoable. Again, we've got a fairly simple formula that we're working with. Operating profit. Now for targeted profit levels, we'll typically get questions like, rather than break even, what would it take for us to get to a particular level of profit? And so when we do that, we're just going to set the target amount as a constant rather than to 0. If we're doing break even, we're going to set the constant at 0. If we got a targeted profit level, we're going to set it at whatever that target level is. So operating profit, going back to the same formula, operating profit is quantity times price minus quantity times the variable cost per unit minus fixed cost. If we have a target profit level, operating profit gets substituted for some constant, whatever that desired target level is, and then we're going to go ahead and go about the same solution. If we've got a constant on the left-hand side of the equation and we got fixed cost, which is also a constant, and it's on the right-hand side of the equation, then I can move that fixed cost to the left-hand side by adding fixed cost to the left and right-hand side. And what I end up with is this formula down here, some constant, whatever that target level is, plus fixed cost equals quantity times price minus quantity times the variable cost per unit, which simplifies to quantity times price minus the variable cost per unit, or said differently, quantity times the contribution margin per unit. And I've got my formula without having to memorize it.